Ghana's debt exchange, the haircut now getting to those investors elsewhere. External bondholders, they are getting 37% haircut in the restructured debts. 13.1 billion US dollars restructured. 4.7 billion US dollars saved, quote unquote. What is the president and finance minister celebrating? Deferred pain? Some economists predict suffering, while others are excited at the reliefs that bring certainty to the financial market. Well, the IMF approves disbursement of $360 million to Ghana. Very irritable Trade Minister Katie Hammond has been snapping at and abusing cement manufacturers for simply asking for consultations over his move to get a law to control pricing of cement. Cement produced by the private sector. Cement prices have risen from 14 cedis in May 2012 to a whopping 108 cedis in June 2024. What exactly is the cause? Is it the manufacturers and the retailers? Or it's about the economy? Well, it will go up again next week, the prices. Just as fuel prices will also go up next week. But how is this government's approach a solution? Those buying their kenke, the one they used to buy for a peswa or at 1 cedi, those buying it today at 7 cedis will definitely disagree with those arguing that it is a matter of inflation and exchange rates rather than profiteering that can be stopped with a law with sanctions, including 3 years jail terms. Alan's 81-page book of bold, transformative policies for a sound economy and governance. One of the usual manifestos we have seen, with a duopoly that continues to impoverish our circumstances and with bad governance. We examine the movement for change's blueprints for governance. Alan is seeking to scrap the useless Council of State that does not account to the people, seeking to reduce the size of government to 40 ministers and fight corruption head-on. We'll examine that. I'm Samson Ladi-Anyanini, and this is Newsfile. It's your most authoritative news analysis platform.
The requirements for the second review, following the staff-level agreement, I'm glad to announce that the IMF Executive Board has today, Friday, 28th June 2024, approved Ghana's second review with overwhelming support for Ghana from the executive directors. Consistent with our resolve to stay the course on the implementation of the $3 billion 3-year IMF support.
Wait until the announcement. The confidence in our economy is going to come back stronger because the world is no longer interested in investing in Ghana because of those there's restructuring. After tomorrow, it will be a different story. Watch the cedi to the dollar after tomorrow. I know you are interested in that story. Let's watch it and see. The confidence will come. The investors will return to Ghana and the growth trajectory would even become clearer for all of us. So this election is an election for us to win. The NDC can no longer campaign on the economy. Our record is better than their record. On the size of the economy, we've done better than them. On per capita income, we've done better than them. On job creation, we've done better than them. On economic growth, we've done better than them. They say we went to IMF, but it's not easy to be under an IMF program because we've seen them before. When they were under IMF program, by 2016, they missed all the targets. So far, Ghana has become an example. We met all our prior conditions and the IMF praised us and disbursed $600 million. This economy will grow, and it will grow faster than everybody thinks. By the end of this year, we are supposed to grow at 3.2%.
Right, so that's the Minister for Finance. Clearly, we are getting into the silly season, but is he speaking facts, or is just the usual political propaganda in campaigns? Dr. Theo Champong is economist and political risk analyst. Dr. Frank Bano is economist and director of research, the Dankwa Institutes. Kofi Adams is MP Boem and member, Public Accounts, Defense and Interior Committees of Parliament. Let me begin with Dr. Theo Champong. Yeah, so Dr. Theo Champong, what do you understand by starting with Amin Adams' invitation to us to watch for what will happen tomorrow, and that tomorrow has actually come and gone? What exactly are you seeing that should happen to the economy because of the restructuring of the debt?
Okay. Good morning, Samson, and I hope you can hear me very well.
Yes, please.
And yeah, it's always a pleasure to be here. I think before we answer that question, it's important to understand, or maybe for the purposes of our listeners, why the restructuring took place. And then we can then look at, what effect that has for the economy. And I think I gave a couple of material to your producers to put on the screen for our listeners. But I mean, we've had 3 levels of restructuring over the last 18 months. We started with the domestic debt exchange. And if you looked at the total composition of our public debt by creditor category, almost about 52%, right? So half of that was comprised of the domestic debt, and there were issues in there more or less to do with the extent of the borrowing and the interest, and the government had to do something about it. And that was a very, very, very painful exercise. And we've been here on this platform many times where we even saw pensioners at one point picketing at the Ministry of Finance over some of the potential, quote unquote, haircut or losses that they were going to suffer. Then you had the second aspect of it, which was the external bilateral debt restructuring. So this is Ghana and the likes of the Paris Club members that we owe, right? And that bilateral restructuring took place and was completed in June, early June, actually, of this year, although we got the initial agreement or agreement in principle in January of this year. The third bit, which was the most, or was going to be the most difficult, was going to be the external commercial debt restructuring, so the Eurobonds. And we knew that the Eurobonds were about 13 billion out of a total of about 20 billion, right, that was available to restructure under that. And to the extent that that actually has now been completed together with the other 2. And this was the biggest albatross, more or less, around the neck of the economy in proverbial terms. Then it actually gives us, in my view, a good cause to now think about how we grow the economy going forward. So the restructuring of the debt it's actually quite significant and very substantial in my view. And I think given the difficult, painful 2 years that we've had, the prospects going forward actually is quite, good for the economy as a whole. It won't happen overnight, as some of my, the MPP or the Minister of Finance is saying about watching the CD to the dollar and all of that. But again, it's important. If you look at the next slide, what exactly we've gotten through this debt deal, and then I'll come to what it means, right? So with the bilateral creditors, we had to forego almost about the effective nominal haircut is about 38%, right? So 5 billion, about 38%. So basically, what the bilateral creditors got is about 62 cents on the dollar. Then in April, when the original proposal to the commercial creditors went through, the proposal was about 71 cents to the dollar. And then they said that it did not meet the debt comparability treatment threshold. So we have to go back and rework the numbers. And the numbers that have come through, more or less, is now closer to what the bilateral creditors offered. So basically about 36, 38 cents on the dollar. And that means that we are having to forego over the next 3 years in terms of the interest and the principal repayments that would have had to make almost about 4.4 or 4.7 billion dollars that we would have had to find money for. That no longer is going to be the case. So you're actually getting some form of debt forgiveness, and then going forward, the debt itself, so the remaining bit that then has been restructured, you look at the coupon structure on those debt, you actually, instead of an average of about 7.5% before the restructuring, now you're looking at about 5% or so. So again, that creates some potential savings cost for the government for the restructuring. So these are, for me, it's important. And it's also important because you look at the economic numbers, and the turnaround within the economy in the last few months is largely been positive. So we saw the numbers that came through from the statistical service. You're still talking 4% quarter-on-quarter growth in real terms. We've also seen just yesterday the IMF announcement of the completion of the second review, which is largely good. And we've even announced some deal with the independent power producers to restructure their debt. So the positive aspect then of it is that this would unlock more financial resources for us or for the country through the interest and the principal write-offs that we're getting, right? And the deferred repayments, but also the additional multinational financing that would come through for us as a country. What effect would that have on the dollar, on growth and the CD and things like that? I think immediately, of course, you see a bit of a show up on the reserves of the central bank with the release of the 360 million. But I think it's going to take a little bit longer for us to actually see that dramatically affect growth as within the timelines that the finance minister is talking about. So I'm a little bit skeptical in terms of the bullish sentiments that the finance minister expresses, but definitely the indicators have begun to turn in the right direction. We can do a lot more to support that, like on inflation and other things. And then I think we'll come to the other point that I talk about, where for me, this agreement is not enough. The external commercial debt that we've done, and then the other one, it is not enough to guarantee any long-term fiscal sustainability. In other words, it would not curb the pace of borrowing and the fiscal recklessness for a number of reasons. And it's important we address that, because as we're already talking about the 4.4 billion potential deferment or debt reprieve that we're getting, the government is already talking, there are two news stories on this. You can go on my Joe Online and then on the Ministry of Finance's website about getting $2 billion from the Koreans and then another $1.7 billion from Afri-Exim Bank for SMEs and infrastructure and other projects, right? Together, this is $3.7 billion if they materialize. And that is almost going to be as much as the savings that we're making over the next 3 years under the commercial debt restructuring. So the 4.4 billion in there, right? So in one sense, you restructure the debt to GDP may come down, but it actually would not, because little have we concluded this that we're already thinking about going, for the next round of borrowing in that sense. And that's what gives me a little bit of a cause, for worry. And I'm sure we can come back later to what do we do to actually curb then the recklessness that we've seen. And
Right.
I have 4 proposals on that.
Right. When we say, help my audience to appreciate, when we say savings have been made, in the domestic debt exchange, we are supposed to have saved 61 billion Ghana cedis. Then the bilateral debts, we are supposed to have saved $2 billion US. And then this one, commercial debt, $4.7 billion US. What does it mean to say we have made savings for which we should be celebrating?
So from a macro fiscal point of view, this is money that you would have had to find to pay the interest and or the principal that is owed, right? The people that you owe. So to the extent that you now actually come in and the people say, well, don't pay all of it or pay some, and even on the interest that is owed, we've actually brought down the interest from a certain percentage. So in the case of the commercial, you're talking an average of about 7.5% to around 5%. You're making a 2.5% to 250 basis points, right? Net difference in that. So basically, in simple terms, is money that the government would have had to find, right? Either borrow more to reservice those old loans, or in extreme circumstances, even print money, right, to service that loan, but actually will end up causing inflation. And this is what it means. It doesn't mean necessarily that the money was there or the government actually had the money there. So if you look at the budget, we make provision for interest payments. So in the 2024 budget, I think in paragraph 376 or 78, we made provision for $56 billion, right, of our expenditure for just interest payments alone under the accrual accounting rules. It does not mean that the government put $56 billion there to actually use that to service the loan facility. But to the extent that they no longer have to get this money or print this money or borrow more to do that, then that, from a point of view of the government,
help me again, Doc. $4.7 billion US on the commercial debt. Is that forgiveness? Is it like some, HIPIC blessing we have gotten? So that debt is wiped off?
Yes, so an element of the debt has been wiped off. So the haircut that the commercial creditors have taken
37%?
38%.
Okay.
Right? In other words, for every 1 CD, assuming that they owed, or $1 that they owe, they're getting back about 64 pesos or 64 cents.
Right.
Yeah, that is how it works out.
Just as happened in the domestic debt exchange program.
Yes, similar thing with the domestic debt exchange, except that, of course, with the domestic debt exchange, what then happened was not on the principal, but the interest bit that was restructured. So
yes, but people have lost, in the domestic debt exchange, people have lost 61 billion of their money, or they have given it as a dash to the government.
Yes, of interest that they would have earned from giving their money to the government, they did not get that.
Right.
And they will be getting some new interest with the 4 bonds that were offered under the domestic debt exchange. And then in this new one, the commercial restructuring, you also have both the cut on interest as well as principal, right? And then you have potentially the extension of the maturity or the duration of these bonds. So if you actually work out the key metric in all of this is the net present value of the nominal debt that you owe. So basically, in simple terms, if you were to take all of the cash flows over the period of 20, 30 years that you owe the money, and you brought it forward or discounted it forward, what would that be worth? Quickly on that, if you look at the bilateral, it was 5 billion. The NPV after restructuring is around 3.2 billion. If you look at the commercial, it's 13 billion that we owe. If you work the numbers as I have done, you're looking at an NPV of around $7.4 billion. So effectively, you're getting, 64 cents on the dollar from an investor.
Let me get to Dr. Frank Bano of the Dankwa Institute. Kenneth Thompson is someone you should know. He's a CEO of Dalex Finance, a formidable finance person in this country. He says, I have been in the business of lending money. Writing off debt is not a small matter, and we have got to face the issue, deal with the reality, and not put pampers on Ghana. It's not going to work. You must be familiar also with Dr. Richmond Etiahene, banking consultant. He says, stuck stuff. We are treading on dangerous path like Argentina and Greece. I hope that doesn't come to us. And we don't want to go there because every 4 years we would have to go and restructure the debt because you haven't put in anything that will be able to pay the cash flows. I conclude with Professor Peter Korte, Director of ISE, who says, this announcement brings some level of certainty to the market because we have been waiting for it for far too long. Many investors, both individual and corporate investors, have been waiting for this news. You know, uncertainty affects the financial market. What do you say to the two gentlemen that I quoted first, comparing what they had to say with Professor Peter Korte?
Well, Samson, thank you very much, and a very good morning to your listeners, and a good morning to my senior colleague, Dr. Tiochum. Yeah, so just as you rightly articulated in the quotes that you mentioned in terms of the debt restructuring, it is also very important, Samson, that we appraise ourselves with the historical background. I mean, in terms of under the Fourth Republic, is it something that we are just seeing it for the first time? Is it something that we've done before? And what were the economic benefits and leverage that came out of these kind of debt restructuring? But then in terms of the commentary that you've said, I mean, let me just speak briefly to it before I go to the underlying historical antecedents and also delve deeper into the benefits or more or less the leverage and the levers that this debt restructuring seeks to offer Ghana as a country to chart a new path, and then going forward, we can look at the things that we can do to also consolidate the gains that we have achieved from structuring this. But something it's important to note one thing, that as a developing economy like Ghana, a country whereby in most of the cases you have your income, I mean, in terms of domestic revenue, far less than your total expenditure, then you would always incur a deficit. And that is something that I think myself, as an academician, I've made this point on several platforms, that as far as you continue to incur a deficit, you would find ways and means to finance that deficit. And obviously, you can do so by going to your central bank to get some kind of financial sustenance there. And if your central bank, for example, if the BOG does not have the capacity to do that, as we saw in 2012, whereby we had a fiscal deficit of 11.6% of GDP, in 2020, whereby because of COVID, we had a fiscal deficit of 10.8% of GDP, then the most likelihood is either to go to the domestic market or to go to the international financial market. But we also know that the chances are that if you are borrowing too much from your domestic market, then obviously it also has repercussions by crowding out private sector investment. And for that matter, you wouldn't also want to endanger the private sector, and for that matter, private investment, which has the capacity to drive your economy. So then the most ultimatum is for you to go out there and borrow, which also at the end of the day, because of your credit rating, I mean, being a developing country like Ghana, obviously, and coming from Africa, your credit rating going to the same financial market wouldn't be the same as maybe your peers in Europe or in the US, who might get the same access of fund at a very cheaper rate, but you would also be borrowing the same fund at a very exorbitant and higher rate. In fact, if Samson, your good self, if you've had a chance to read some of the World Bank and IMF publications, one of the things that these publications seek to outline is the fact that the cost of accessing finance by developing countries and developing economies, for that matter, African countries, sometimes it's outrageous, I mean, compared to their peers from even Eastern Europe or Asia or elsewhere across the globe. So that is also the stark reality that we are faced to contend with. Then coming back to the core issues of Samson and trying to set the background for this. In 2001, if you quite remember, when President Akufo assumed office, where we had a debt to GDP of about 182% of GDP, I mean, one of the things that President Akufo's economic management team, together with foreign consultants, saw was that the domestic debt was one of the things that actually was impeding Ghana's progress in terms of financial sustenance and viability. In fact, the domestic debt stood at 6.1 trillion, representing about 91 and 182-day treasury bill and 1 year treasury bill notice only, and that we're paying so much in terms of interest in servicing these debts that's actually in 2001. So one of the things that President Akufo thought it wise to do was to restructure these domestic debts. And one of the key things that you saw was whereby we had to go through the process of having the government of Ghana index a linked bond, whereby we realized that, look, we cannot be paying an interest rate beyond the actual growth rate of our economy. You can't be paying an interest rate of about 17, 18, 20%, whereby your economy is growing at around 3, 4, 5% thereabout. Then how do you generate enough to service these flows that are coming in? So if you remember very well, these bonds were indexed, and then it was set at a rate of 5%. That is the growth rate at that time, perceived to be at that time, that we were not going to pay any interest beyond this point for the next 3 years, which gave us that room for the economy to have that fiscal breathing space. So if you take a look at that data at that time, in 2000 and in the years ahead, that is 2002 and 2003. In 2002 alone, that decision saved Ghana about 187 billion Ghana cedis, and in 2003, it saved us 481 billion Ghana cedis under that domestic debt restructuring sort of that we did in 2001. Similarly, it was this project that actually helped us to leverage on or serve as a catalyst to have that well-developed government bond sector that we have in Ghana today. So Samson, that has been our history, and that is where we are coming from. Now, coming back to the substantive issue at hand, whereby we are talking about the restructuring of these debts, Samson. I mean, it has the benefits, and it also has the other aspects. But I want to focus on the benefits for now, but going ahead in terms of what we can do to make sure that we do not find ourselves in where we find ourselves again is somewhere maybe we try to assess the antidotes and then the remedies that we can also prescribe in that matter. And also something, so I would like to look at these debt restructuring in two forms. So the first form that I will look at it is the stock treatment. Now, the stock treatment is whereby we have the 37% haircut that Dr. Tiocham obviously said. And then the flow aspect is whereby we have the interest reduction, whereby we are having an interest of about 5%, which is going to give us a savings of about 4 billion. So in terms of the stock, that is the amount of money that we're supposed to pay, including the principal, then the country is earning about $4.7 billion thereabout. But what does this mean, something? And how is this even important to the Ghanaian economy, or the ordinary Ghanaian, my mother in the village, who elsewhere? How does it even affect them? Now I want to look at it from an analogy, something. Now imagine you have a big credit card bill, something, and it can also be interpreted this way. If I owe you money and I come to pay, and you say, no, don't pay, but keep it, then certainly it will be interpreted that you have given me money, isn't it? Because at that point in time, I could have invested that money in something else to earn me returns, which I can also use in furtherance of my personal development or my personal growth. And for that matter, if we are looking at it as the general economy, then that is something that we can also look at it. Now, on the savings angle, something, I would also want us to look at this analogy, something. Imagine you have a big credit card bill and you are struggling to make payments. Then the credit card company comes to you and give you a break that no payments for a while. They say for the next 3 years, so in the case of Ghana, from 2023 to 2026, that we are not supposed to pay interest on these bills. So you don't have to pay us anything. What does it imply? This simply means that you save the money that you have been paying on interest, which at the time that maybe you might have generated enough funds within your economy to service this interest. Now,
that's like deferred suffering or pain. Perhaps
yes.
Perhaps what in Chi it will be said, is that it? You are just deferring what you suffer.
But see, the most important point here is that if we are taking a look at the 2024 budget statement, which was read, and I think Dr. Tuichampo mentioned those figures, and I think what he said was in dollars, but I think they are in Ghana cedis, if I'm right. I mean, I think the total expenditure is about 224 billion Ghana cedis, and out of the 224 billion Ghana cedis, about 119 billion Ghana cedis, which covers both our compensation and interest service. And I think interest service alone is costing us about 55 to 6 billion Ghana cedis in that regard. So something, if you have an economy like this, whereby your first two expenditure lines are monies that are going into compensation. Let's put compensation aside, that's another topic for discussion. But then the second leading line of expenditure is interest payments. And if you look at the same budget and you're looking at allocations to MMDAs and all government agencies at an amount of about 38 billion Ghana cedis, then you have a problem. So in terms of the amount of money that you are using to service interest alone, it's far greater than the amount of money that you are giving to government or state mandated institutions, then you certainly have a problem. So if this is the case whereby you are being told that, look, Samson, today, within the next 3 years, you can keep this money. You don't need to pay this money swap. Then obviously, you can rationalize expenditure by investing these sums of money into prudent ventures of their economy. You know that this is a developing economy, and when it comes to infrastructure-wise, when it comes to agriculture and other critical parts of the economy, a lot is required in terms of funding. So if we are having this fiscal room, as I have rightly described it, and then we don't need to pay these monies within the next 3 years, then obviously it gives government that leverage to invest in these critical sectors of the economy, which has more or less come to a stop. And we've seen it in various parts of the country whereby roads were started and then it had to be paused. So obviously, we cannot downplay the significance or the importance that this restructuring brings to the economy.
I'm going to ask this question to you and also to Dr. Tuichampo before I come to the studio. And it's on the back of a statement by Franklin Cudjoe of Imani, Ghana. And he was responding to what the president said. He said, I told you we knew how to bring the economy back to life. And that's a comment about the economic recovery that we are beginning to see. And Franklin Cudjoe says, yes, but for how long and at what cost? You literally forcibly pickpocketed our savings after promising not to do so, just so you could buy time from external creditors to postpone paying the humongous debts you contracted for mostly vanity projects until 2026, when you are no longer in power. No other Ghanaian leader and African leader in recent times ever invaded citizens' savings as a result of supervising wretched microeconomic governance and ecological suicide through Galamsey. Not even President Ruto of Kenya, whose country spends a third of their GDP in debt servicing, but still facing turmoil over taxes, ever did this. In fact, all right, so do you understand and appreciate Franklin Cudjoe, what he says? And he gives an advice to conclude. I've cut part of what he has to say. He says, my advice is simply this. Please invest some of the nearly 4 billion savings made solely because you wouldn't have to pay debts you scrambled for until 2026 in only growth multipliers, and the rest in a sinking fund to help your innocent successor, in case it is not Baumia, to breathe a little from what has truly been a fiscally reckless journey. The next IMF visit is imminent unless the next government reduces overall expenditure by at least 40% and embark on freeing the private sector and all individuals from the many vampire taxes and charges. Yes, Doc.
Yes.
He's speaking the reality, is it not?
I mean, there are some factual inconsistencies in that statement, and I want to set that premise right. I mean, if Franklin says that the borrowing has been as a result of this government's lackluster management of the economy, that can be termed as a factual inconsistency. For example, what was our total debt stock in 2008 before the NDC took over? Our total debt stock and I use dollar terms because the dollar is the most stable currency in the world, agreed or can be disagreed, but that is the reality. Now, in 2008, our total debt stock was about $8.07 billion. Now, between 2009 and 2016, our debt stock had actually ballooned from $8.7 billion to $29.2 billion, and that's an average year-on-year increase in terms of the nominal figure of about 261%. Now, currently, in May 2024, the BAG financial data that was published, and this is a public data that you can peruse. What is our total public debt? Our total public debt stands at, I think, about 51.7 billion USD. So, in terms of the year-on-year addition from 2017 to today, Nana Akufo-Addo's government had done barely 80% in terms of the cumulative addition of debt stock. I mean, if you are considering the marginal changes from where I am coming, so that can never be termed as a mismanagement. Yes, it's not something that yes we should be proud of, but in terms of managing the changes, the actual changes or the growth rate in debt stock, I can say here on authority based on the data that I have spoken to that Nana Akufo-Addo and Dr. Mahmoud Bawumia's government have actually managed the growth rate of debt better than any other government under the Fourth Republic, especially if you are gauging the NDC as the alternative in managing debt. In fact, Sansa, it is very instructive to know that between 2013 to 2016, we actually had a year-on-year growth of between 90.1% in terms of the debt accumulation, just under former President John Dramani Mahama. So obviously, this premise can never hold any water. Then he also comes to the issue of the sinking fund. I think the sinking fund is something that has been in existence even during the NDC's time. In fact, if Franklin has taken his time to read the annual public debt report, he would get to know that most of the bonds that were subscribed by this government in 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021, part went into the annual budget funding amount. Then the remaining were used to buy back bonds that had been subscribed by previous government. For example, the NDC government subscribed a bond in 2015, which actually matured in 2021. The Eurobond that we issued was used to buy back, I think about $800 million was spent to buy back that part of that bond, and the remaining amount went to the sinking fund. So this is something that this government is already doing as established. And like I keep saying, if you read those reports, they are duly there. But however, what I want to touch on is that in terms of the forgiveness, yes, of course, I don't think it's something that is even new. In fact, the finance minister himself has reiterated this point, that he has offered two-way solutions out, that we create either a sinking fund and then we put these monies in there, or we also invest this money into instruments that will generate enough wealth going into the future if we are supposed to repay this debt that is from 2026 onwards.
All
then
right.
we can also have that room to also pay. So these are already...
Thank you, Frank. Theo, for many Ghanaians, they hear all the rhetoric, and in a few minutes we'll be going to discuss cement prices, and they would gauge it from that perspective, that in 2014 cement was selling at 31 Ghana cedis. In fact, in 2022 it was selling at around 55 Ghana cedis. Today it's over 100 Ghana cedis. So when there is this political struggle about who has done better, they clearly can tell who has done better in managing the economy, because as far as they are concerned, these prices are a reflection of the management of the economy. What do you say to Franklin Cudjoe when he suggests that the president or government or the country should not be doing anything like celebratory, that we have managed the economy, we are getting a recovery, and so on?
No, I mean, absolutely. Franklin is my boss, and he's very much spot on a number of the issues. I think it calls for sober reflection, because we've seen these celebrations before, right? Remember, we had the famous hat trick in 2019, right? And we had the big kinky party at the Ministry of Finance, only for us to end up going back to the IMF, right? Just down the line. And it reflects the fundamental issue about, value for money, the rate of borrowing, the expenditure, and then actually the amount as well. And again, back to the cement analogy that you gave, which is absolutely right. In fact, if you actually work out the cement prices in dollar terms from 2010 or so onward, it has barely changed, right? It's probably worth about $8 or so thereabouts per bag. What has changed is actually the exchange rate, and which in a way reflects, in my view, the poor management of the economy over the last couple of years, particularly in the last few years, when all the signs were there in terms of borrowing that we're actually heading for a crash down the line. So I struggle a little bit with my colleague Frank on here when we use a bit of the flow argument in terms of the debt growth rate and all of that. If you actually look at the numbers, and you're right that in 2009 when the new 2008-9 when the new administration came into power, President Mills, it was just about $9 billion Ghana cedis for what we owed, right? And then in 2016, it went up to 126 or so billion. And as we speak now, you're talking a little close to 600 billion, right? With or without the forgiveness that we've gotten. But the important point for me is
122 or 26 billion to now,
by the end of 2016.
And to now, how much?
Now, the last number that I had, we were talking, let me just check my spreadsheet here because I collate these numbers.
I had 600.
The last number that I had, and you can look at the Bank of Ghana report as well, it's actually close to about 600, right, billion Ghana cedis, right? So you can work out the growth rate and all, but we can also look this.
But Doc, forgive me for interrupting. Does this jump, quantum leap, not confirm what managers of the economy have been telling us, that we went to abnormal times? Because how is that normal? You showed Prof. Mills's time, then you showed John Mohammed's time, and then suddenly about how much percentage leap. That tells you that
if you work out the numbers, right, it's a very simple math. Between 9 billion to 125, 26 billion, it's a bigger jump than from 120 to 600, if you work out the relative change. But that is not the point. And that is where I'm trying to actually get our politicians, and let us forget about this politics of comparison. I came to meet this and I added that because the reality is that we're broke and we cannot pay our debt, and therefore we had to go to the creditors, right?
So I'll need you to hold on. We want you to conclude this discussion nicely for us with your last slide on the solutions that you are seeking to provide. So let's hold on with that for now. Let me come to Kofi Adams in the studio, and let's hear him also on this subject. You were just itching to talk because you felt that Dr. Frank Bano was not being fair to the facts and to the figures. Kobna, for example, says that theoretically, Dr. Bano is attempting to create value for the supposed debt relief. Unfortunately, from a rational and pragmatic economist perspective, this is hogwash. He is assuming the savings will be invested. Unfortunately, this reckless government will either invest in phantom projects without any tangible returns, or they will dissipate them through rampant corruption. What Akufo did was to spend them in social infrastructure that were tangible and branded. Again, this is deferred misery. Unless the structure of the economy is not changed through deliberate interactions rather than the existing free market policy to improve the income base and at the same time curb imports, we are bound to be worse off in a decade. That's the fear of many.
Yeah.
Yes.
Samson, thank you and good morning to your guests via Zoom, Dr. Tio Achampong and Frank Bano. But seriously, you were right. And Dr. Bano attempted to present a picture that truly doesn't exist. First was his attempt to link what happened in 2001 to what is happening in 2022. In 2001, you had a president who had just been elected, who had not engaged in any reckless borrowing and investment. In other words, he may not have even created the situation. 2022, you have a government that has been in power for 6 years, supervised, created the situation, borrowed, and invested recklessly in areas that brought no returns.
Are you not misinterpreting him?
No.
Because he only went to Kufuor's time to show us that this has been done before, but in a different way.
Well, whatever has been done, I'm only trying to say that Kufuor came in 2001 to meet a situation. He handled it in a different way. Don't equate the two to where they have caused this themselves. 2, he also attempted to look at the debt dollar denominated. Good to do that, but that is academic dishonesty. One group, Mills Mahama, borrows, invest appropriately, so they are able to manage the depreciation of your currency. In other words, another one comes, borrows, and mess it up. So your cedi depreciates so much that your debt value in terms of cedi goes so high. Then what you do is to try now converting that debt into dollar in order to bring it so down. So when you compare to what existed before, you say, oh, the borrowing after all have not been much if you compare to...
What you leave out is what Dr. Bamia calls, is it the triple whammy? Okay?
You see...
What we must acknowledge about the impact of COVID and the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war.
Samson, the Auditor General's special report on audit, as far as COVID is concerned, makes nonsense of anyone who says COVID is to blame for what happened to us. Even before COVID, we were already having challenges. Why? When COVID itself came as a disease, what were we being told? That persons with underlying conditions suffered more than those without underlying conditions. So if your economy had underlying situations, COVID, of course, will come and make your situation worse. The data shows that before COVID, Ghana was in a bad situation. Immediately we exited the IMF program. That was an opportunity for them to do what they wanted, and never invested these resources in appropriate areas. Of course, the funds that came in during the COVID period, the Auditor General's report, which the Public Accounts Committee of Parliament is even yet to interrogate, demonstrate clearly that the government did not invest right. They did not utilize the COVID funds appropriately.
You actually say COVID was a blessing.
Yes, because it gave us opportunity to raise monies that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to raise. And Samson, I did that analysis indicating that if you lose your father, assuming, I don't pray that anybody loses the father, and the funeral is conducted, and the funeral generates a lot of funds to you than the cost of treating your dad and the conduct of the funeral. You cannot, 5 months later, come to tell me you are unable to pay rent because you've lost your dad.
Especially if you got $1 million from the funeral.
Exactly, you got $1 million from the funeral. So, and if you look at the Auditor General's report on COVID monies and how it was expended, this government have no excuse to blame that. Not too long ago, you see, they say, he who the gods want to kill, they first make mad. Not too long ago, our president was in Ukraine. Doing what? Begging for help. The same Ukraine that you say is the reason for your problem. You are there begging them.
I didn't pay attention to that, but did the president go to Ukraine to beg for help?
Well, what was he there doing?
Who goes to Ukraine to beg for help at this time?
Was he there? Well, was he there to solve their problem? Was he there to solve their problem? The Russia-Ukraine that has been mentioned severally, which forced the Russian embassy in Ghana here to issue a statement and to give clear indication as to the trade arrangement between them and Ghana, and to indicate that Ghana should stop citing Russia-Ukraine activity as a reason for their problem. This usually do not happen. But Samson, it has happened under this government. You see, the whole debt deal, well, it's good that you have some kind of reprieve for servicing of interest and what have you. But like you rightly said, it's more like you are postponing the slap that you are supposed to take that inevitably you will take. But my biggest fear, Samson, is how this government utilize funds that is available to it. You remember what Mills Mahama administration did when they got some funding? They invested in targeted areas. Example, one key example I'll give you, the Atuabo gas. Before that investment, we used to spend over $300 million every year importing gas, if not more. But as a result of that investment, Ghana now saved that money and could be utilized in other areas. That is what we call positive and progressive investments that yield results. But when you have a government that takes your money and pay for Pualugu multipurpose dam, which is not done, your 11.9 million goes waste in Pualugu multipurpose dam, which is not done, and you are told that it's for feasibility studies and what have you, when no structure exists there. Samson, when you have a government that takes your money and pay $2 million into a SkyTrain project that does not exist, that had no license, that the two sector ministers of that rail development have clearly indicated they knew nothing about. When you have a government that pay contractors for no work done on the motorway, when you have a government that engage in such reckless expenditures, then you ask yourself, who do you blame? Look at bonds. At least two bonds.
But at least you acknowledge that the restructuring and what we are hearing from the IMF is good reprieve. It is setting us on a tone to recovery, however long it will take, however the suffering that may await. It is good. Is that not it?
It's good, but I was reading something about the IMF report, and I want to just read it out for you, for everybody to know what exactly I think is wrong when they base their analysis just based on figures. One of the things the IMF says is that government is investing, broadening the investment in social mitigating areas. Samson, we are all seated here and we hear complaints about non-payment of capitation grant that goes to support education at the basic level. We are here talking about LEAP that is not being paid. We are here talking about many social services that is not happening. And if IMF is basing its analysis on just paper submission, but not what is happening on the ground, then the people will be suffering and the paper will be deceiving them. Talk about inflation and check the cost of basic food items. And ask yourself, if somebody comes to tell you that inflation is dropping drastically, would you accept that person based on what you feel on the market? That if you have to buy...
Who has said that? Who has said inflation is dropping drastically?
That's what's in the report, that we're doing so well. Let me just try and then...
I don't think anybody will say inflation is dropping drastically
Samson,
when we can see where it is going. But of course, there's some confidence that is resurging. You don't have to be an economist to see that this will happen.
But Samson, unfortunately, that is what the IMF report has submitted to us is indicating that government is done so well in all those areas.
Let me go to...
In all those areas, and I'll get it for you.
Let me go to Frank briefly, and then to Dr. Tio Chapon to wrap up for us. President Akufo-Addo was in the Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland, and he was heard clearly condemning the bullying by Moscow and the aggression that it is taking in, as it were, attacking Ukraine in the manner it is doing. And Ghana has been supportive of Ukraine over the period. And there was this talk about, looking to have some agriculture exports to Ghana. He definitely didn't go there to ask beg for money.
Samson,
quickly.
let me just read quickly, yes.
Yeah.
He said, these efforts are underpinned by reforms to bolster revenue mobilization and streamline non-priority expenditures, Okamura explained. The authorities are also expanding social protection programs to mitigate the impact of fiscal adjustment on the most vulnerable. The Bank of Ghana maintained a prudent monetary policy stance to sustain a rapid reduction in inflation and took steps to rebuild international reserves.
Okay.
This is what the IMF, these are the basis upon which is commending government. And I'm not the one saying, I'm saying that the reality we have on the ground does not match this kind of statements.
All right, thank you. Dr. Frank Bano, maybe a brief, I'm sure you will want to react to Kofi Adams, but don't go to Ukraine. I've explained that in COVID, we know that we had some 21 or almost 22 billion Ghana cedis that we got, the funds that we mobilized. We also had some almost 4 billion US dollars that we got as a result of all the funds that were mobilized during COVID, about 22 billion Ghana cedis and about 4 billion US dollars. What do you see for you also on the back of the World Bank's disbursement to us at this particular time? The disbursement of 360 million US dollars to Ghana.
Samson, thank you. So just a quick one. I mean, Mr. Adams, Honorable Akufo-Addo, Honorable MP, talks about the fact that the NDC government invested the money in prudent projects, and for that matter, that is why they were able to restructure the economy. I just want to read something to Mr. Honorable Adams. This is the Ghana Economic Update Report, October 2014, and I just want to read something here for Mr. Adams listening. Now, this is very, very important. And then the net international reserve, I'm reading from this report, had declined. This is in 2014. The net international reserve had declined to $601 million in June 2014, covering only 12 days of imports of goods and services. Mr. Honorable Adams, would you call this prudent management of an economy, where you have your net international reserve declining, one of the lowest so far recorded in the history of Ghana, to $601 million, covering just 12 days of import cover in 2014? And that was one of the reasons why the NDC government had to quickly run to the IMF, if you quite recollect this. So clearly, if we are talking about prudent management of the economy, then we have a better picture than what the NDC painted for us between 2009 to 2016. I mean, between 2014 to 2015, 2016, what was our growth rate? We were doing barely 2.2, 2.8, and 3.3% as growth rate. In 2017, what was our growth rate? Our growth rate was over 8%. If you have a government that has put over 2.5 million Ghanaians, both males and females, into free senior high school, free, and you tell me that this is not prudent investment in human capital, then clearly we don't have a definition of prudent management of resources. If we are talking about infrastructure, Mr. Adams.
Okay,
now,
so Dr. Frank Bano, hold on 1 minute for me. Listen to the finance minister, Dr. Amin Adams. Listen to him and come back to my specific question to you to end your submission. The specific question is, getting the 360 million US dollars from the IMF, which the board has approved after, the review, how does it look? How does the economy look for you going forward? But let's listen to the finance minister first.
Announcement. The confidence in our economy is going to come back stronger because the world is no longer.
After meeting the requirements for the second review, following the staff level agreement, I'm glad to announce that the IMF Executive Board has today, Friday, 28th June 2024, approved Ghana's second review with overwhelming support for Ghana from the executive directors. Consistent with our resolve to stay the course on the implementation of the $3 billion 3-year IMF-supported with COVID-19 Program for Economic Growth, PCPEG, we successfully hosted an IMF mission in April 2024, which came to Ghana to undertake the second review of the implementation of the program. This is coming after an earlier approval of the first review in January 2024. This is yet an important positive development in our journey towards macroeconomic stability. And we expect to receive the third tranche of $360 million by Monday, 1st July 2024, which will bring the total disbursement 1.56 billion US dollars.
Right. Yes, Dr. Bano.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, clearly, like you rightly said, I think this disbursement happened yesterday. I mean, yesterday, late in the night, we got a news of the fact that the IMF board has approved, and for that matter, this disbursed the 360 million USD. And it is very, very important that we rationalize the utilization of this money, Samson. And this I'm speaking as an economist. And one of the difficulties I have had over the year in terms of looking at our budget expenditure lines has got to do with the amount of money that we spend on compensation, something, for example. I mean, like, if you look at the 2024 budget, that we are spending close to about 66 billion Ghana cedis on just compensation, and next year, it's most likely to go to about 75, 80 billion Ghana cedis, depending on the agitation for increment in compensation. So that is a worry, something. But then over the years, the question I have asked myself is, what has been the returns from compensation payment to workers in Ghana in terms of their contribution to overall GDP and productivity of the economy?
All right.
So if we move away from where we are, Samson, and talking about rationalization, then we should be targeting more capital areas that we can actually invest these monies, and we'll be able to generate enough returns going forward in the future that we can also invest in other parts of the economy, such as agriculture, the health sector, education, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the things that I think going forward ought to do, and then
Thank you very much. Dr. Tue Champong, you were getting ready to share with us your proposals to curb fiscal recklessness, which is so rampant in our system. That keeps us going to the IMF, and we are looking to go to the IMF, is it the 19th time or so? Frank Bano is hoping that this will be the last, but we have always said it's the last, and it's never ending. Yes, what do you say?
We've all said that this hopefully will be the last, but you need to take certain prescriptions in order not to go back to the doctor, right? That's the thing. Because even the last point that he made, and I'll come to the fiscal issues in a moment, right? The reserves argument that we're talking about here, and I think Frank, you quoted something about 12 days. But interestingly, you look at the 2022 data, and at one point, we also had almost 2 weeks, right? Our reserves could only cover us 14 days, right? So my concern as economist, someone from an independent perspective, is that we often then come to this politics of comparison. My record is better than yours and all of that. When in reality, when you look at it, most times it's actually been abysmal. I mean, amongst the two main parties. And I think we could do better generally as a country. And I'm hoping that, you know, as we enter the political season with a lot of the debate and the discourse, we will have avenue to interrogate some of these numbers, you know, even some more. Because again, you look at the COVID thing, and you know, there's lots of money that we got, over 21 billion Ghana cedis, right? And you ask yourself, okay, what did these monies go into? The Auditor General's report is there, you know. But
yes, Doc, is 21.8 billion Ghana cedis and 3 point something billion US dollars. That's what we got from COVID.
So, but the point is, where did this, or what, how were these monies more or less utilized? We have a big issue in this country with spending and value for money more broadly. And this cuts across political regimes, you know, because of the nature of how the political economy tends to work. And
please, let's move on to your prescriptions. I was just mentioning the 3.8 billion US dollars because you mentioned only the 21.8 billion Ghana cedis. That's all.
Yeah. Okay. So what do we do? I think there are 4 things. Some of them we've already highlighted. The sinking fund. The interesting thing is that in the sinking fund, you read section 37(1)-4 of the Public Financial Management Act 921. It gives the minister the mandate to actually create the fund. And as far back as 2016, when we started with the second oil production and things like that. The fund was actually set up, but we never took it serious. We never actually put in the monies that are needed to actually service these debt obligations as and when they are due. So my proposal there would be further amendment to that, but in a way that you can actually force the hand of the minister and then the controller and accountant general who actually administers the fund under Section 39 of the PFM Act to make sure that we are putting monies regularly to service our debt obligations. The worst thing is to actually have someone who owes you money and still living, as though tomorrow would never come in that sense. Number two, I think that for a lot of the commitments that we see from our ministries, departments, and agencies, many of these loan agreements, if you look at the fiscal impact analysis, often it's not there. Many times there's even no business case or a strong one supporting, these interventions. If you look at the budget, the 2024 budget, paragraph 377 says that going forward, we should actually have a public investment management appraisal process, and every project going forward should have a seal of quality that is approved or given by the Minister of Finance. It'll be interesting to see to what extent this has, taken shape since the budget was announced. But any project or any loan over $1 million, for me, I think we need to have a very clear business case with an intervention logic showing how you actually would use those resources to impact the people, and it helps with monitoring and evaluation. The third point is the re-establishment of the Fiscal Council. So this was done in 2018, then we set it aside during the pandemic, and for me, the arguments that we made, that and then the fiscal rules actually was untenable. But the council, together with Parliament, and there's a new committee actually in Parliament called the Economic Committee, would allow us, if well-resourced, to effectively scrutinize fiscal policy. So, for example, they would evaluate our fiscal performance vis-a-vis the target from an independent perspective. They would also look at fiscal risk. They look at how this, affects the long-term sustainability of Ghana's public finances. And the bit that I'm particularly more keen on is that they would scrutinize and cost a lot of the tax and the welfare policies that we are bringing on board, because often that is where you get a lot of weaknesses and therefore avenues to misspend, money. And then related to that, again, it's a legal issue, is the amendment to the Act 982, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and then the PFM Act itself to strengthen the sanctioning regime. It's a beautiful piece of law. And ordinarily, if everything were working, we shouldn't actually have been at the IMF in this first instance. But the reason why it doesn't work is that some of the sanctions that are in the relatively weak, and the enforcement of them becomes, suspect. So I think if we can work on some of these, if not all, in the short to medium term, luckily I know that part of the IMF technical assistance is actually working on some of these things, on, like, for example, the Fiscal Council. This will help us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Theo Champong. And we take a break here. We return to talk about cement prices. Dr. Baidu says that, kindly tell your guests that the most important thing to me as a Ghanaian currently is the exchange rates, price of fuel, which goes up next week, cement price, which goes up next week again, and food stuff, and not the statistics. Of course, when the price of fuel goes up, food will also go up. It says, and not the statistics. Statistics could be manipulated to paint whatever picture we want to present. We don't eat statistics in this country. We'll be right back.